So that's actually easy.
You basically don't.
I don't read most of them.
I shouldn't be saying this publicly.
I mean, there's no way anybody can keep track of everything.
People telling me, oh, there's this new cool paper.
It's always good to be driven by some research question.
Read as many papers as possible that are relevant to your research.
Well, I follow ePrint almost every day.
I would go through the titles.
I try to skim the titles.
I always go over the titles and abstracts of all of these.
Half of them you don't need to read beyond the title.
I think the number of papers have exploded in the recent years. I want to think of it as a good thing. There are many good papers to choose from, and depending on how much time and resources you have, you might have to be selective in terms of what sort of papers to read. So if it is sort of clear which area you want to work in, then if your time is restricted, then you can end up just reading the papers that are very relevant to your area alone. Of course, there are some papers that are so good that you have to read them whether or not you're working in this area. And the general suggestion is to, read as many papers as possible that are relevant to your research. It's important to sort of understand how the different areas connect with each other. What are sort of the common techniques used in the in your research area?
That's a good question. So, I mean, at this point right now, I feel like I mainly read the things that I'm asked to review. Not a lot else. But yeah, so I mean, so I guess like when I was a student, at some point I had like set up a bunch of like RSS feeds and stuff like this to like pipe like papers to my phone, like a news apps basically, to like browse through while standing in line waiting for lunch or something like this. And so I read like lots of titles and abstracts and at this point, and I would save things. I would star them and like open them with the intent of looking deeper later. Almost invariably, I just never did. I read when I want an ingredient, I guess. If I'm working on some project and I'm like, is this possible? Like, maybe it's like not exactly what I need for the project, but there's sort of some question that comes out of what we're working on, then, then I'll sort of read in this area to see if something is possible. But yeah, I think it's hard to commit to reading. Most papers are very long, very complicated. I'm not 100% that there's necessarily a lot of insight to be gleaned from actually reading the whole thing. In too many cases, a lot of it is like just very technical work, and there's like one key idea basically that's good to know, but it's not worth reading the whole paper for that. Yeah, I mainly read, I guess if I'm actually going to read something in depth, it's probably because I want to use some part of it for something else. Yeah, otherwise, I'm curious. I try to just, get a loose sense of what people are doing, but like I'm not reading these papers. I'm skimming the title and, like, oh, that's cool. That's nice. That sounds exciting. Not it's just sort of like a topical survey. Yeah. I do it when I'm bored, basically, I guess, or like, I'm procrastinating. Like I really should be doing something else. Maybe I'll sign into ePrint and see, oh, what was submitted this week, and but I definitely don't read everything, I guess, even when doing this. Like, yeah, so I only look at things that sound exciting to me. If it's not, so for ePrint, my interests are pretty like philosophical, I think, in terms of like by cryptographic standards. So like 99% of what's submitted to ePrint, maybe not 99, but like a good chunk of what's submitted to ePrints like immediately you know, there's some acronym that I don't know what it means. It's like I automatically don't care, or maybe don't care is the wrong. I shouldn't be saying this publicly, but it's like, you know, yeah, yeah. But yeah, I look at things that you know, you skim title. I will skim titles and say, and then only read the abstract if the title speaks to me. But just like for aesthetic reasons, basically. Like it's not like it necessarily, like the things I actually read, I'm like searching for through, you know, like in finding the paper. But like, and if I'm like perusing ePrint or ECCC or something like this, you know, it's like I'll look at something just because it's like looks interesting, you know, by whatever subjective quality. I think this is important. It's important to sort of develop, you know, perspective, and sometimes you see like, oh, like how's that possible, and like learn something deeper. Or come back later.
So that's actually easy. You just choose the favorite problem, that favorite paper. That
maybe a short answer to this is that it's always good to be driven by some research question, I think. Like you have some maybe vague research question or research topic in mind, and then purposefully read the paper with this kind of goal in mind.
It's really very, very hard. I mean, there's no way anybody can keep track of everything, obviously. I guess I find that my social network is getting more and more important, in the sense that since I cannot keep track of everything, then my network can do better, at least. So talking to people about what's new, what do you think is interesting, and so on, seems to become increasingly important, because just trying to, you know, look over last week's or last month's uploads at ePrint doesn't really do you much good, I think, because there's just tons of stuff, and you know, you tend to just read stuff from people you know, if that's the only thing you do, and that is not necessarily the best way, right? Because you might miss some really important stuff from people you never heard about. So I think that's probably trying to rely on as many different brains as possible is probably one way to go, at least.
I don't read most of them. So I read papers when they're directly relevant to research project of mine. I read papers, of course, when I have to review them. And there's a lot of papers someone tells me about, or that I hear about or hear talk about, and I think, oh, this is, I see on ePrint, and I think, oh, I really want to read this. So it comes on my to read pile. It's a big pile, but it's difficult to actually sit down, because, at least for me, because there's always more things that feel more urgent, like, for example, the papers that now need to be read because they need to be reviewed, or that I need really for a research project. When I sit down and read papers, it's always incredibly helpful. No matter if it's in the research topic I'm working on, or in the research topic is something completely different, because I always feel like either there's no new techniques that you can potentially use later, or there's new exciting areas that you can work on that you never even thought about before. To sit down and read a paper, I find it's difficult to start. And what really helps me is to either just say, okay, I'm just gonna read the introduction, and like to make it not seem like such a big, like I don't have to read a 60-page paper today. And it can also be helpful to be really focused. So to just set a time, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, and then in this time, just reading the paper and not doing anything else, not checking emails, not getting distracted by whatever happens in front of the window. And then often after 90 minutes, I'm so in the paper, I will still continue reading, but just the getting in there, it helps to set the time. yeah, that's what I can say.
Fortunately, I probably have to admit that I read less than I would opt for. So, okay, so I do get from the IACR the weekly email with the list of papers that were published on ePrint during the week. So I always go over the titles and abstracts of all of these. So this makes sure that I will not completely miss something that I really need to know about. But as you said, of course, it's impossible to read so many papers. So the first that I try to identify are things that are related to my work, and especially to my current research projects. So if there is something that is really relevant to what I'm currently doing, that's most important. And then mainly out of curiosity, things that are related to other works of myself. But yeah, it's very difficult to read so many papers. And of course, even the notion of reading, there are different levels of reading. So, okay, I read many abstracts, but unfortunately, not too many papers like really reading. In this context, by the way, maybe it's not directly related to the question. I think one of the most important roles of conferences is to do this selection for the community of just choosing, the subset of papers that are really more interesting than others and really people should know about. In recent years, there is this trend that I, of course, understand its motivation, but there is this trend to, accept more and more papers to conferences. And, in few years, also our conferences, each of them will have a few hundred papers, and you'll not be able to hear all these talks and so on. So this is, in a sense, a shame, because at least in the past, when the number of papers in conferences were smaller, you could say, okay, I'll wait to the next, whatever it is, crypto, and go to hear as many talks as I can in the 4 days of the conference. And then out of those talks, I'll choose those that, were able to attract my attention, or the talk was good, or the result sounds good or interesting, or but yeah, I mean, deciding on what to read or what, it's really becoming difficult. And I always feel that I don't do enough, but yeah, it's not.
Well, I follow ePrint almost every day. Whenever I see an interesting title, I always read the abstract. And for the papers which are related to my topics, again, I read the abstract and I do a quick check on the paper, basically looking for theorem statements. And then if I want to know more details about the paper, I mark it, and whenever I have time, I read the paper. So basically, I choose papers that are related to my topics. I cannot keep track of all the different papers, but I check ePrint every day to follow the news and what papers are out there.
Yes. There's two different kinds of approaches to this that I'm combining in a way. So one is you occasionally just skim through what's happening on ePrint, and then if there's something that I find particularly interesting, particularly relevant, basically from title, maybe title and abstract, I'll read it, or I'll at least read quickly through it. And then there's the other side where I'm working on some project where I'm really basically thinking through the related work and section, and then of course, well, usually at least, you have some idea of some papers that did something related, but when you're starting working on something. And then you dig through not the latest papers on ePrint, but basically one topic, you drill in to everything you can find, and then also not just ePrint, right? We have most papers on ePrint, but there's still quite some relevant material that is not. So I think that's a combination of those. And then, well, this skimming through what you find on ePrint and reading the most relevant ones, that's maybe complemented by people telling me, oh, there's this new cool paper, you should totally take a look, or we should totally take a look. So students of mine doing this and collaborators of mine. And so that's basically the filter function, I guess.
You basically don't. When there was about 800 papers, 500 to 800 papers a year on ePrint, it was copable. Start again. When there was 500 to 800 papers a year on ePrint, you could cope with the amount. It's only about like 20, under 20 papers a week. So you could kind of look at the the titles and go, okay, I'm going to read that, and if there's 20 papers a week, you can kind of go, in your area there's probably only going to be one, so it's kind of like reading one a week. It's kind of you can cope with that. 1600 plus 2000, forget it. Just don't even worry about keeping up with it. So how do I deal with that? I read the papers when I need to. I read the papers when students tell me I should. Every week we have in Leuven we have various different groups that discuss different papers. So like the MPC group will look at MPC papers, the public key group will look at public key papers, the symmetric key group will look at symmetric key papers, the blockchain group will look at blockchain papers. So we have lots of different reading groups, and I think reading groups are good because it means that you have someone else explain it, and you learn to do the paper together. And as long as you're kind of looking at one new paper a week, I think that's kind of good. Okay, except in your first year of your PhD, where you should spend all your time reading papers, and it's very depressing.
So for choosing which papers to read, I try to skim the titles of, on ePrint every once in a while. And sometimes it's if the title looks interesting, I'll read the abstract. And if the abstract is interesting, I'll maybe read a few part of the intro. And then the few much smaller subset of papers that are real in areas I'm very interested in, those I will look at carefully. I don't know if I have any like great tips for finding those. It's hit or miss. As for how to read them, I try to read a paper by So the way I read a paper is definitely not linear from beginning to end, just reading it like a book. I find myself that I read a little bit of the intro, and then I always pause and think to myself, is this an interesting question? How would I try to solve this myself before actually trying to read the solution? And even while I read the solution, I do it in very small steps. If I can't, maybe I already have some idea how it should be solved, and I try to see, is that what the paper does? Does it follow that approach? If I have no idea, it seems like something real, I have no idea even where to start, I would try to read maybe a little bit like, what's the first idea that they had? How did they start? And then, can I fill this in? Can I actually continue? And I find that's the only way I can really understand a result, by trying to do it myself first, because otherwise, if you just read a solution, it's very hard to appreciate it, to know why the paper chose to, made the decisions they made, why they do it this way. The only way I really know how to appreciate it is to try it myself and see if I would do something similar.
Basically, I would go through the titles of the recent ePrint papers. ePrint is usually faster and more comprehensive than other resources, but it's also good and bad papers mixed all together. So we have to make our own judgment. I will choose those titles I feel interested in and click in. If the abstract and introduction still look interesting and within my area of expertise, I will read them carefully and in details, discuss them with my colleagues and students in our weekly seminars.
No, I do read some, but very, very few. Every few months I go and I look. If it's very relevant to my own work, somebody already commented on it to me, and I can go immediately after it's put on ePrint. But You know, it sounds terrible. I mean, 1,600 papers, but you know, half of them you don't need to read beyond the title to know that you're not interested in. And this may be even 70%. And the rest, you know, you can be surprised, but if you know the community, you know which papers to read. If you don't know the community, you will learn by reading which papers not to read in the future. Maybe some people work, they call it for some routine reasons. Like some people work on a different area, but they use a terminology that looks similar to your area. You read the first paper on subject X. You think, oh, it's very relevant to me. You see, it's something else, but it's called subject X by this person. And then there's the next paper by that person on subject X square. You said, if it's that X, I'm not even reading it, yes? If you have a set of people that are working with you, if something comes up which is very relevant and you miss it, they usually tell you. Of course, some people are very lone operators. And for them, I think keeping up with the literature is much harder, because there's a lot of time spent on nothing.